I never thought a routine clinic visit could change everything, but when the nurse leaned in closer, her gaze locked onto mine and her hands lingered, I knew this was no ordinary checkup. "Do you want me to continue?" she whispered, her voice trembling yet commanding. My heart raced as I nodded, unsure if I was crossing a line I could never step back from. It all began innocently enough. I had been feeling a bit under the weather for a few days. Not sick exactly, just off. My friends finally convinced me to get checked out, urging me with the usual, better safe than sorry. So, I found myself sitting in a quiet clinic, flipping through a dog-eared magazine while the sterile smell of disinfectant lingered in the air. The calm of the place was almost unsettling, amplifying the nervous flutter in my chest. When my name was called, I glanced up to see a nurse standing in the doorway. She had a kind yet professional demeanor, her mid-30s appearance marked by an aura of competence. Her soothing smile instantly put me at ease as she motioned for me to follow her. She led me to a small, pristine examination room, where the faint hum of an air conditioner filled the silence. The nurse's movements were methodical, setting out the instruments she needed, stethoscope, clipboard, and forms. Everything about her exuded professionalism. "Take a deep breath. This won't take long," she said, her tone calm and reassuring as she motioned for me to remove my shirt for the routine vitals check. I complied, though a twinge of awkwardness surfaced as her hands brushed against my skin. She didn't seem to notice, or if she did, her focus remained unwavering. I reminded myself it was all part of her job. Yet, as the minutes ticked by, I began to feel an unusual warmth in the air, a shift in the atmosphere that was hard to ignore. Her questions were typical. "Have you been experiencing any discomfort? Any pain here or here?" But her gaze lingered a little too long, her hand resting against my arm just a fraction longer than necessary. It was subtle, so subtle that I wondered if I was imagining things. Still, there was a tension I couldn't explain, a magnetic pull I had no name for. This was just an ordinary checkup, I told myself. She was just doing her job. But deep down, a quiet voice whispered otherwise. And as her eyes met mine again, something inside me stirred. A feeling I didn't fully understand, but one I knew would change everything. It wasn't long before the tension in that small, sterile room began to shift into something undeniable. What started as a simple health checkup had morphed into an encounter that felt anything but ordinary. The nurse continued her routine, yet there was something in the way her hands moved, gentle yet lingering, that made my pulse race. I told myself it was just the natural awkwardness of being vulnerable in a medical setting, but I couldn't ignore the growing awareness of her presence. As she asked me to lie down for further examination, her demeanor remained calm and professional. Still, there was something in her voice, a slight undertone that I hadn't noticed before. "Let me know if you feel any discomfort," she said, her tone steady, but her gaze lingered as her hands moved to examine my chest and abdomen. My breath hitched, and I tried to focus on the mundane details of the room to distract myself. The sharp smell of sanitizer, the soft glow of the fluorescent lights. But my focus kept snapping back to her. "Are you sure there's been no pain or swelling?" she asked, her hands lightly pressing against my side. I hesitated before responding. There was no pain, not physically at least, but the discomfort in the air was palpable. "No, nothing," I muttered, though my voice felt uneven, betraying the storm of thoughts swirling in my head. Her touch moved lower, her hands brushing the waistband of my pants. I tensed, unsure of what to expect next. "I'll need to check here for any irregularities," she said, her tone still professional, but there was a softness in her voice that hadn't been there before. The air between us seemed to thicken, charged with something neither of us could acknowledge aloud. I nodded, unable to form words, my throat dry. As her hands continued their examination, I felt a warmth that wasn't just from her touch. My heart raced, and I wasn't sure if it was from nerves, embarrassment, or something else entirely. Her movements were deliberate, yet there was a tenderness to them that I couldn't ignore. When she finally paused, her hand resting lightly against me, I looked up and saw a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. "It seems there's something unusual here," she murmured, her voice barely audible. My breath caught in my chest. I couldn't tell if the moment lasted seconds or minutes. All I knew was that it felt as though the world had narrowed to just the two of us, the clinical setting dissolving into the background. Then her gaze met mine and something unspoken passed between us. A question she didn't dare ask aloud, and an answer I couldn't find the courage to give. "Do you want me to continue?" she whispered, her tone no longer that of a nurse addressing a patient. It was something else entirely, something that made my heart skip a beat. I nodded, almost imperceptibly, and her hand moved again, her touch as light as a feather but charged with an intensity that left me breathless. The professional boundary between us felt like it had shattered, replaced by something neither of us could define. Every instinct in me screamed that this was wrong, that I should stop it before it went any further. But I didn't. The tension was unbearable, the kind that makes your skin prickle and your heart pound. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer, with possibilities I couldn't face. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to look away from her, to break the moment that felt like it could change everything. Somewhere deep down, I knew this wasn't normal. A nurse and a patient weren't supposed to share moments like this. But that realization only added to the unease, to the strange and intoxicating pull I felt. Whatever this was, it was only just beginning, and there was no turning back. What happened next felt surreal, as though I were caught in a dream I couldn't wake from. The sterile walls of the clinic blurred into insignificance, the quiet hum of the air conditioning drowned out by the deafening sound of my own heartbeat. Her hands, which moments ago were merely performing their professional duties, now felt purposeful in a way that went beyond medical necessity. Her eyes locked onto mine, searching for something, perhaps permission, perhaps reassurance. "I need to be thorough," she said softly, her tone teetering on the edge of authority and uncertainty. My pulse quickened, and I nodded, unable to form a coherent response. Her fingers moved gently, almost tentatively at first, but there was an unmistakable charge to her touch, a tension that made every inch of my skin hypersensitive. I told myself it was all in my head, that the electricity in the air was just a figment of my imagination. Yet when her hand lingered for a moment longer than necessary, I saw the flicker of hesitation in her expression, the kind of hesitation that spoke volumes. There was something unspoken between us now, something that neither of us dared to acknowledge yet couldn't ignore. When she leaned in to adjust her position, her breath brushed against my neck, sending an involuntary shiver down my spine. "Relax," she murmured, though her own voice carried a tremor that betrayed her calm exterior. Her professional composure was beginning to crack, and I could see it in the way her hands trembled ever so slightly, in the way her lips pressed together, as though holding back words she couldn't say. I tried to focus on the routine nature of the examination, to remind myself that this was simply part of her job. But when her fingers brushed against me in a way that felt deliberate, too deliberate to be accidental, I couldn't deny the truth any longer. This wasn't just a routine checkup anymore. It had transformed into something entirely different, something dangerous. "Does this hurt?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, though my throat was too tight to form words. Her gaze lingered on mine for a moment too long, and in that moment, something shifted between us. It was as if the air itself had thickened, pulling us closer together despite the invisible line we both knew we shouldn't cross. Her touch grew bolder, her movements more deliberate. Each time her fingers grazed my skin, it sent a jolt of electricity through my body, igniting a fire I hadn't realized was there. She leaned in closer, her proximity making it impossible to ignore the faint scent of her perfume, the warmth radiating from her. "I just want to make sure everything is okay," she said, though her voice betrayed her. It was no longer the voice of a nurse addressing a patient. It was something softer, something more intimate. I should have said something, should have stopped her. But instead, I found myself leaning into her touch, my body betraying the turmoil in my mind. Her hand rested on my chest for a moment. Her fingers splayed, as though she were feeling the rapid beating of my heart. Her eyes darted to mine, and I could see the internal battle she was fighting, the same battle that raged within me. "I don't usually," she began, her voice trailing off as she looked away, her cheeks tinged with a faint blush. For a moment she seemed unsure, as though she might stop and pull back. But then her gaze returned to mine, and the hesitation in her expression melted away, replaced by something far more primal. When her hand moved again, there was no mistaking the intention behind it. Her touch was no longer clinical, no longer part of an examination. It was deliberate, tender, and charged with a longing that mirrored my own. I felt my breath hitch as her fingers brushed against me, her movements slow and deliberate, as though she were savoring every second. The space between us seemed to shrink, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. "I shouldn't be doing this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But even as she said the words, her actions betrayed her, her hand lingering as though it had a will of its own. "Do you want me to stop?" she asked, her voice trembling with both fear and anticipation. I should have said yes, should have stopped her before things went too far. But instead I shook my head, my lips forming the word no before I even realized I'd spoken. The line we had been tiptoeing around was gone, erased by the heat of the moment. Her hand moved with newfound confidence, her touch igniting a fire that consumed every rational thought in my mind. I reached for her, my hand brushing against hers as if to confirm that this was real, that this wasn't some fever dream. In that small, sterile room, time seemed to stop. The nurse who had seemed so composed and professional just moments ago was now someone entirely different, a woman caught in the throes of forbidden desire, just as I was. The boundaries between us blurred until they ceased to exist, leaving only the undeniable pull that had drawn us together. We both knew it was wrong, knew that crossing this line could have consequences we couldn't foresee. But in that moment, none of it mattered. All that mattered was the heat between us, the unspoken connection that neither of us could deny. The sterile air of the exam room seemed to crackle with tension as the boundary between us shattered completely. Her hands moved with deliberate intent now, her gaze fixed on mine as though daring me to acknowledge the line we had crossed. My heart pounded in my chest, a deafening rhythm that drowned out the faint hum of the air conditioning. Every fiber of my being screamed that this was wrong, yet I was powerless to stop it. She leaned closer, her breath brushing against my neck, sending shivers down my spine. "This isn't supposed to happen," she whispered, her voice trembling yet resolute. But even as the words left her lips, her actions contradicted them. Her hands roamed with newfound boldness, each touch igniting a fire that burned away every rational thought. The weight of the moment was suffocating, and I felt myself slipping further into the abyss of temptation. The room seemed to shrink around us, the walls pressing in as if to contain the intensity of what was unfolding. Her professionalism was gone now, replaced by something raw and unrestrained. Her hands, once clinical and detached, now trembled with emotion, betraying the conflict raging within her. She paused for a moment, her fingers lingering against my skin as her eyes searched mine for something. Permission, perhaps, or absolution. I gave her neither, but my silence spoke volumes. "I can't stop," she murmured, her voice barely audible. The weight of her confession hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. And then, as if the admission freed her from the last vestiges of restraint, she leaned in closer, her lips brushing against mine in a tentative kiss. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, but it quickly deepened, fueled by weeks of suppressed desire. Time seemed to slow as the kiss consumed us both, an unspoken agreement that neither of us could deny. Her hands tangled in my hair, pulling me closer as the space between us disappeared entirely. The sterile walls of the clinic faded into the background, replaced by the heat of the moment and the rapid beating of our hearts. But then, as if the universe itself had conspired against us, there was a sound, a sharp, distinct knock at the door. We froze, our eyes wide with panic as reality came crashing back in an instant. The spell was broken, and the weight of what we had done descended upon us like a tidal wave. She pulled back, her breath coming in ragged gasps as her eyes darted toward the door. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice strained but steady. There was a brief pause, and then a muffled response from the other side. "It's just me. I need to grab some supplies," the voice said, casual and unsuspecting. My stomach dropped as I realized how close we had come to being caught. She straightened her uniform hastily, her fingers fumbling as she tried to regain her composure. I did the same, adjusting my clothing as my mind raced with the implications of what had just happened. The door handle jiggled, and for a moment, I thought it was all over. But then the voice outside added, "I'll come back later," and the sound of retreating footsteps filled the silence. We both exhaled at the same time, the tension in the room shifting from passion to dread. Her hands trembled as she smoothed down her skirt, her gaze fixed on the floor. "We can't do this," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. But the words felt hollow, lacking conviction. We both knew it wasn't that simple. I reached for her, my hand brushing against hers in a gesture meant to comfort, but she pulled away sharply. "No," she said more firmly this time. Her eyes met mine, and I could see the conflict there, the war between what she wanted and what she knew was right. "This has to stop. Now." Her words stung, but I couldn't deny the truth in them. We had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and the weight of that reality was crushing. I nodded slowly, my throat too tight to form words. The silence between us was deafening, filled with all the things we couldn't say. She turned away, her shoulders slumping as though the weight of her guilt had finally caught up with her. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "This was a mistake." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I couldn't argue. She was right, of course. It had been a mistake, a beautiful, terrible mistake that neither of us could take back. I wanted to say something to comfort her or reassure her, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stood there, rooted to the spot as she moved toward the door. She paused with her hand on the handle, her back to me. "You should go," she said softly, not turning around. "Before we do something we'll regret even more." Her words cut deep, but I knew she was right. I gathered my things, my movements slow and deliberate, as though dragging out the moment would somehow make it less painful. As I reached the door, she stepped aside to let me pass, her gaze fixed on the floor. I hesitated for a moment, wanting to say something, anything, to break the suffocating silence. But in the end, I said nothing. The walk down the hallway felt interminable, each step echoing loudly in the quiet clinic. I could feel her gaze on me as I walked away, but I didn't dare look back. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on me, a mix of regret and longing that I couldn't shake. As I stepped out into the crisp evening air, the reality of the situation hit me like a tidal wave. What had started as a routine checkup had turned into something I couldn't explain, something that had the power to unravel both of our lives. I knew I should feel ashamed, but all I could think about was the look in her eyes. The way her touch had made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. The connection between us was too strong, too undeniable to simply walk away from. And as I stood there on the sidewalk, the cool breeze biting at my skin, I realized with a sinking feeling that I would be back. I didn't know when or how, but I knew I couldn't stay away, not from her, not from what we had shared. In the days that followed, the weight of what had happened in that exam room settled over me like a dark cloud. I couldn't stop replaying every moment in my mind. The tension in her voice, the warmth of her touch, the way she had looked at me with a mix of longing and fear. It was maddening. No matter how hard I tried to focus on other things, my thoughts always circled back to her. I avoided the clinic, telling myself it was for the best. The last thing either of us needed was to face each other again. But staying away did little to ease the turmoil in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. I felt her hands. I heard her whisper. It was like she had taken up permanent residence in my thoughts, and there was no escaping her. The guilt came in waves, crashing over me at the most unexpected moments. I thought about the boundaries we had crossed, the lines we had shattered in a single reckless moment. She had been right, it was a mistake. But it didn't feel like one. That was the worst part. Despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. I wondered if she felt the same. Was she as haunted by what had happened as I was? Or had she moved on, burying the memory under the weight of her professional obligations? The thought of her carrying on as if nothing had happened filled me with a strange mix of relief and resentment. I didn't want her to suffer, but I didn't want to be the only one stuck in this endless loop of regret and longing either. A week passed before I saw her again. I had convinced myself I needed closure, that I couldn't keep living with this weight on my chest. So, I returned to the clinic under the guise of needing a follow-up appointment. The waiting room felt smaller, more suffocating than before. My heart raced as I waited for my name to be called, unsure of what I would say, or if I would say anything at all. When she finally appeared in the doorway, our eyes met, and the air between us crackled with unspoken tension. She looked different, more composed than I had expected. But there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a hint of recognition, a shadow of the moment we had shared. Without a word, she motioned for me to follow her. The walk to the exam room was silent, the atmosphere heavy with everything we weren't saying. When the door clicked shut behind us, I could feel the walls closing in. She busied herself with her clipboard, avoiding my gaze as she went through the motions of the appointment. But her hands trembled ever so slightly, betraying the calm facade she was trying so hard to maintain. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," she said finally, her voice soft and hesitant. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. "I needed to," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't stop thinking about what happened. Her hands stilled, and for a moment, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. "Neither could I," she said finally, her voice tinged with sadness. She set the clipboard down and turned to face me, her eyes meeting mine with a mixture of vulnerability and resolve. "But we can't keep doing this. You know that, right?" I nodded, though the words felt like a lie. I knew she was right, knew that what had happened between us couldn't continue. But a part of me couldn't let go, couldn't accept that something so intense, so undeniable, had to end. "We have too much to lose," she continued, her voice trembling. Our careers, our reputations, everything. And I can't. I can't risk it. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I knew she was right. The risk was too great, the consequences too severe. Yet even as she spoke, her eyes betrayed her, filled with a longing that mirrored my own. I don't know how to stop, I confessed, my voice breaking. I've tried, but I can't. I keep replaying it in my head, over and over. And I know it was wrong, but it didn't feel wrong. Her expression softened, and for a moment, I thought she might step closer, might give in to the pull between us once more. But then she shook her head, her resolve hardening. We have to stop, she said firmly, though her voice wavered. We don't have a choice. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. I nodded, though my heart rebelled against the truth of them. I'm sorry, she said softly, her voice filled with regret. For everything. I wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault, that I was just as much to blame, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I simply nodded and turned toward the door, my chest tight with unspoken words and unresolved feelings. As I walked away, the weight of what had happened between us settled over me like a stone. It was over. It had to be. But even as I left the clinic, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end, not really. There was too much left unsaid, too much unresolved. And though I knew I should stay away, I also knew deep down that I wouldn't. Not forever. In the weeks that followed, I wrestled with the fallout of what had happened. The memory of her touch, her gaze, the quiet tension in that room lingered like a shadow, refusing to fade. Every time I thought I had pushed it from my mind, something would pull it back. A stray thought, a familiar scent, or even the sound of her voice echoing in my head. It was a cycle I couldn't seem to break. But as time passed, the intensity of those memories began to dull. The guilt I had buried deep down finally began to surface, demanding to be acknowledged. What we had done wasn't just reckless, it was wrong. We had crossed a line that should never have been crossed, and the consequences of our actions, though unseen, were undeniable. I realized I had to confront the truth, not just about what had happened, but about myself. Why had I let it happen? Why hadn't I stopped it when I had the chance? The answers weren't easy to face. I had been caught up in the thrill, the forbidden nature of it all. It had felt intoxicating, consuming. But now, looking back, I saw it for what it was, a moment of weakness that had come at a cost. I thought about her often during those days. I wondered how she was coping, if she felt the same heavy weight of guilt and regret that I did. Part of me wanted to reach out, to see her again, to find some sort of closure. But I knew it would only make things worse. Whatever connection we had shared, it was over. It had to be. One day, as I sat alone in my apartment, I found myself writing a letter to her, not to send, but to unburden myself. I poured everything onto the page, my regret, my apologies, and my hope that she could forgive herself for what had happened. Writing it felt like a release, as though I were finally letting go of the weight I had been carrying. I came to realize that what had drawn us together wasn't just physical attraction or the allure of the forbidden. It was something deeper, an emotional void we had both been trying to fill. For me, it was a sense of longing, a need to feel seen and understood. For her, I could only guess. But whatever it was, we had found it in each other, however briefly, however destructively. As the days turned into weeks, I began to heal. The memories no longer consumed me the way they once had, and I found myself reflecting on what I had learned. I realized that boundaries exist for a reason, that the lines we draw are there to protect not just ourselves, but the people around us. Crossing those lines, no matter how tempting, always comes with a cost. I also learned the importance of accountability, of owning up to my mistakes instead of running from them. It wasn't easy to face the truth, to admit that I had been complicit in something I knew was wrong. But it was necessary. Only by confronting my actions could I begin to move forward. Months later, I found myself walking past the clinic where it had all started. I stopped for a moment, my gaze lingering on the entrance. For a brief second, I felt the familiar pull, the memory of her face flashing through my mind. But then I shook my head and kept walking, my steps steady and purposeful. It was over. And though it had taken time, I had finally come to terms with it. What we had shared was fleeting, a moment of passion that burned bright and fast before extinguishing itself. It had left scars, but it had also taught me lessons I wouldn't soon forget. As I moved forward with my life, I carried those lessons with me. I vowed to never let myself be consumed by weakness again, to always respect the boundaries that keep us grounded. And though the memory of her would always linger in some small corner of my mind, I knew I had to leave it there, in the past where it belonged. In the end, I realized that moments of weakness don't define us. What defines us is how we choose to move forward, how we learn from our mistakes and grow. And as I closed that chapter of my life, I knew I was stronger for it. If you were in this situation, what would you have done? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more suspenseful, emotional stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Hit that bell icon so you're the first to know.